Hi, Jay. Thank you so much for being with us today, especially being sequestered at home, quarantined at home. So we really appreciate your input here. As you know, April is Fair Housing Month, so we really are focusing on that. So we thank you for being here. I want you first, if you could, talk about how the coronavirus has impacted fair housing practices in your experience so far.
Well, and thank you, James, and for your group for inviting me to speak. I appreciate it. I think, in terms of the impact, the economic impact that's had on all groups, including the LGBTQ community, which I think I saw some statistics that a third of the population makes less than $35,000 a year, more likely to be involved in the service industry, the gig economy. So the financial impact of this and the ability to be able to afford housing, feeling housing insecure, whether or not you can make your rent or your mortgage payment, and whether or not you're able to be able to purchase a home. I think that has impacted people. I think also this crisis has taken away the focus on LGBT civil rights. For the most part, people are prioritizing things related to healthcare and other very important things. But I think the focus on the disparities in terms of equal treatment in terms of civil rights has gotten less focused during this time period.
Right. So it's not just an LGBTQ issue. It's also kind of falls into a socioeconomic issue.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there's a perception a lot of times that the LGBT community is like this monolithic community, wealthy, white, male, and cisgender. And of course, it's a very diverse community. And many of the issues that point out the disparities in our system with access to health care and financial inequalities, that also reflects that in the LGBT community as well.
Right. So I think a lot of people probably don't know, even realtors don't know, that Michigan doesn't provide protection based on sexual orientation, gender identity, or sexual expression. What kind of work is being done currently? I know that there's some work being done to add those to the Elliott-Larsen Act in Michigan. Can you share with us just some of the work that's being done? Because I do think it'll have a significant effect on real estate.
Sure. Well, for more than 20 years, legislation has been introduced in the Michigan legislature that would explicitly mention the categories of sexual orientation and gender identity. For the most part, they're never able to move forward because the legislative leadership will not allow them to have committee hearings. And so that's been problematic. Also, our federal civil rights laws also don't have those explicit categories of sexual orientation and gender identity. Having said that, though, there have been a number of court cases, federal court cases, that have interpreted civil rights laws that prohibit sex discrimination as covering LGBT people. And there even was a fair housing case involving a transgender person, and they were found to be protected under the category of sex. And so as a result of some of those case decisions, in 2018, our Michigan Civil Rights Commission, they issued an interpretive statement that LGBT people were protected under Michigan civil rights laws under the category of sex. Now, it's not a court order, but it has the force and the effect of allowing the Michigan Department of Civil Rights to take LGBT discrimination complaints. And so since May of 2018, if you're an LGBT person and you've been discriminated against in employment, education, housing, or public accommodations, you can file a complaint with the Michigan Department of Civil Rights, and they will investigate that. We also have at the federal level, employment discrimination under the category of sex is also, they'll take complaints involving discrimination against LGBT people. What's at stake though right now is last October, there were two court cases before the United States Supreme Court, and they're deciding whether or not LGBT people are protected under federal civil rights laws that prohibit sex discrimination. Now that's in the context of employment. And one of those cases is an ACLU case. It involves Amy Stevens, a transgender woman who was fired from her job for being transgender. Now, if the Supreme Court decides to uphold those lower federal court decisions, then we have this theory that we can use, and we can continue to advance this argument that LGBT people are protected under current civil rights laws, and they're protected against housing discrimination. If the court reverses those favorable decisions, then that's very highly problematic. So the bottom line is this, as you mentioned, James, we need to have those explicit categories in our federal and state civil rights laws, so we don't have to leave it up to the courts. So we have the Equality Act, which is a federal piece of legislation that would specifically cover sexual orientation and gender identity, and that would include the categories of housing. It passed the U.S. House of Representatives. Senate leadership Mitch McConnell will not move it forward. The president has indicated he would veto such legislation if it passed out of the Senate. And so that's kind of where we're at. I should also mention that there's 40 plus local communities in Michigan that have human rights ordinances, local ordinances that prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity in housing, including, the communities of Southfield, Birmingham, Royal Oak, Ferndale, Huntington Woods, etc.
Right. And by the way, thank you for the work you're doing on behalf of that. I know you've done a lot of work in that area. For your information, I think it's important for all of us to recognize in the Realtor Code of Ethics, sexual orientation and gender identity are protected. You may not discriminate based on those things. So the National Association of Realtors has been fully behind these efforts on local and federal levels. And so it's good to hear what's actually happening, because I don't think a lot of folks understand that. And thank you again for your efforts in that area. So when we bring it down to realtors or to even the general public, what are some of the ways that we can kind of refocus on fair housing, or even just begin to focus on fair housing with regard to the LGBTQ community?
Well, I think it's important to outreach to the community to let them know that there are certain protections in place, certainly with the Realtor Code of Ethics, to help people. I think people who are able to purchase a home or to rent a home, or they're concerned about communities, living in communities that are going to be supportive of who they are, supportive of their families. And I think it's no surprise when you look at a community like Ferndale or Royal Oak, where there is a noticeable presence of LGBT local businesses and signs showing that, that in support of the LGBT community, that makes an attractive place that people want to live in. The kinds of complaints that I often get from individuals in the community with regarding their housing is they are feeling harassed by neighbors because of who they are, because of either their sexual orientation or their gender identity, and not feeling that the community is supportive of them. And, as I mentioned before, there's also been fair housing studies that have done regarding LGBT people. There was one done about 10 years ago in Michigan that showed pretty significant housing discrimination, at least in the area of rental, against same-sex couples. And we also know that discrimination against transgender people is even much, much more blatant. And as a result of that discrimination, less transgender people more likely to be able to financially afford a home. So, and I think is also as part of those outreach efforts is helping people identify maybe financial mortgage or lending programs that would enable people to realize that dream that they might have of being a house owner.
Right, and I think you kind of segued into our next question. And actually, the National Association of Realtors last time came out with a profile of the the LGB community with regard to housing issues, wants and needs, motivations. We've had trouble quantifying transgender so far, but hopefully we'll have some statistics on that in the next couple of years. So we know that, when you look at statistics with regard to home buying, the reasons for it, rentals and so on, the LGBT community kind of lags behind others, all things being equal. You kind of answered that question but maybe you could say more specifically, what are the fears? You know, and you mentioned community, you mentioned lending opportunities. Is there something that goes beyond that that we should recognize and hopefully be sensitive to with regard to just getting that community into the real estate market?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think in addition, because of the discrimination resulting in, in terms of many LGBT families living below the poverty level, more so than we would see of, heterosexual couples who are raising families, and the concern about security and whether or not being supportive in a particular neighborhood or community. I think the other thing is I think a lot of LGBT people, if they want to talk with a realtor, they want to feel that they're being recognized in terms of, in other words, it's not only a comfortable place that they can deal with, but what are some signs that a real estate company recognizes the diversity of buyers? Is there a rainbow triangle maybe on the door of the real estate office? Are there, in terms of materials and things that, in marketing materials, do you recognize diverse families, including, same-sex couples, raising children, transgender people? I think many times the LGBT community, they're looking for different, sometimes it's very simple gestures that show that they're being recognized and that they're being included. And many times people might not feel comfortable in being in an environment where this is something new and different to them. They've never owned a home before in their life. They've never purchased a home, but also, do they see themselves, as part of this community that they're maybe interested in purchasing a home in?
Right, right. And what's interesting is that that's the same feeling across all cultures, whether it's ethnicities, people of color. So it's the same common issue that I think sometimes people don't recognize. And so that's good to know that, in general, as a brokerage or our next question that you've led into very, very nicely. As individuals, as realtors, and I like to look beyond our community as realtors, because we're also humans and we live in these communities and we support these communities. And we talk about, fair housing starts with us. How can we reach our realtor community? How can we reach our neighbors, our friends, to help them understand how they can be more inclusive with their practices, with their everyday conversations, especially when it comes to real estate?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think studies show that communities that support diversity and welcome diversity tend to thrive better economically. And you look at the communities that are doing quite well in the state of Michigan, in terms of housing markets, and you guys would know that much better than I am. But you look at a community like Ann Arbor, or like I said, Royal Oak, or Southfield, or Huntington Woods. Some of those communities. Those are communities that have welcomed and embraced diversity, and not only just based on sexual orientation and gender identity, but also you see a great deal of racial diversity, and that makes a difference for people. And so I think everybody, to help encourage members of a community to understand the benefits of diversity, and also a community that has a local human rights ordinance that's LGBT inclusive, that sends a very important symbolic message to people that yes, you are welcome, and that if you encounter difficulties, you have some sort of protections. I think that's very significant.
Gotcha, perfect. So one last quickie, and then we'll let you go. Where can we find a list of those communities that do have gender identity and sexual orientation protections? Is there a place where we can find that list so we know what those communities are?
Well, I used to have a list that's a little outdated, but I think Equality Michigan might have that list. I pretty much know a lot of the communities in Oakland County, Wayne County, and Macomb County that have those local ordinances. And a lot of times they don't have significant remedies to redress discrimination that a civil rights law would have, but they do send a very powerful message to people, what is acceptable, what's not acceptable, but also this idea that, we are a welcoming community, and we would like you to be a part of our community.
Great, thank you. And we will provide the link to Equality Michigan for folks on this this video chat, so they know exactly where to go, and hopefully that's helpful. So Jay, thank you so much. We go way back, and I so appreciate you spending some time with us and helping us just get better at what we do. It's, we look at the code of ethics, we look at inclusion as just being good business. And so we appreciate all you do on our behalf with regard to that.
Thank you for this opportunity, and you guys keep up the great work you're doing.
Thanks, Jay.
Thank you.